How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 16. Guard Your Weak Point. He that is slow to anger is better than mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. Bible. The first and best of victories is for a man to conquer himself. To be conquered by himself is of all things the most shameful and vile. Plato. The worst education, which teaches self-denial, is better than the best, which teaches everything else and not that. John Sterling. Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power. Seneca. The energy which issues in growth or assimilates knowledge must originate in self and be self-directed. Thomas J. Morgan. The foes with which they waged their strife were passion, self, and sin. The victories that laureled life were fought and won within. Edward H. Duart. "I'll sign it after a while," a drunkard would reply, when repeatedly urged by his wife to sign the pledge, "but I don't like to break off at once. The best way is to get used to a thing." "Very well, old man," said his wife, "see if you don't fall into a hole one of these days with no one to help you out." Not long after, when intoxicated, he did fall into a shallow well, but his shouts for help were fortunately heard by his wife. "Didn't I tell you so? It's lucky I was in hearing, or you might have drowned." He took hold of the bucket, and she tugged at the windlass, but when he was near the top her grasp slipped, and down he went into the water again. This was repeated until he screamed, "Look here, you're doing that on purpose, I know you are." "Well, now I am," admitted the wife. "Don't you remember telling me it's best to get used to a thing by degrees? I'm afraid if I bring you up sudden you would not find it wholesome." Finding that his case was becoming desperate, he promised to sign the pledge at once. His wife raised him out immediately, but warned him that if ever he became intoxicated and fell into the well again, she would leave him there. A man captured a young tiger and resolved to make a pet of it. It grew up like a kitten, fond and gentle. There was no evidence of its savage, bloodthirsty nature, and it seemed perfectly harmless. But one day, while the master was playing with his pet, the rough tongue upon his hand started the blood from a scratch. The moment the beast tasted blood, his ferocious tiger nature was roused, and he rushed upon his master to tear him to pieces. Sometimes the appetite for drink, which was thought to be buried years ago, is roused by the taste or the smell of "the devil in solution," and the wretched victim finds himself a helpless slave to the passion which he thought dead. When a young man, Hugh Miller once drank the 2 glasses of whiskey which fell to his share at the usual treat of drink of the masons with whom he worked. On reaching home he tried to read Bacon's Essays, his favorite book, but he could not distinguish the letters or comprehend the meaning. "The condition into which I had brought myself was, I felt, one of degradation," said he. "I had sunk by my own act for the time to a lower level of intelligence than that on which it was my privilege to be placed, and though the state could have been no very favorable one for forming a resolution, I in that hour determined that I should never again sacrifice my capacity of intellectual enjoyment to a drinking usage, and with God's help I was enabled to hold by the determination." In a certain manufacturing town, an employer one Saturday paid to his workmen $700 in crisp new bills that had been secretly marked. On Monday, $450 of those identical bills were deposited in the bank by the saloon keepers. When the fact was made known, the workmen were so startled by it that they helped to make the place a no-license town. The times would not be so hard for the workmen if the saloons did not take in so much of their wages. If they would organize a strike against the saloons, they would find the result to be better than an increase of wages, and to include an increase of savings. How often we might read the following sign over the threshold of a youthful life: "For sale, grand opportunities for a song, golden chances for beer, magnificent opportunities exchanged for a little sensual enjoyment, for exchange a beautiful home, devoted wife, lovely children, for drink. For sale, cheap, all the magnificent possibilities of a brilliant life, a competence for one chance in 1,000 at the gambling table. For exchange, bright prospects, a brilliant outlook, a cultivated intelligence, a college education, a skilled hand, an observant eye, valuable experience, great tact, all exchanged for rum, for a muddled brain, a bewildered intellect, a shattered nervous system, poisoned blood, a diseased body, for fatty degeneration of the heart, for Bright's disease, for a drunkard's liver. With almost palsied hand, at a temperance meeting, John B. Gough signed the pledge. For 6 days and nights, in a wretched garret, without a mouthful of food, with scarcely a moment's sleep, he fought the fearful battle with appetite. Weak, famished, almost dying, he crawled into the sunlight. But he had conquered the demon which had almost killed him. Gough used to describe the struggles of a man who tried to leave off using tobacco. He threw away what he had, and said that was the end of it. But no, it was only the beginning of it. He would chew chamomile, gentian, toothpicks, but it was of no use. He bought another plug of tobacco and put it in his pocket. He wanted to chew awfully, but he looked at it and said, "You are a weed, and I am a man. I'll master you if I die for it." And he did, while carrying it in his pocket daily. There was an abbot that desired a piece of ground that lay conveniently for him. The owner refused to sell, yet with much persuasion he was contented to let it. The abbot hired it, and covenanted only to farm it for 1 crop. He had his bargain, and sowed it with acorns, a crop that lasted 300 years. So Satan asks to get possession of our souls by asking us to permit some small sin to enter, some one wrong that seems of no great account. But when once he has entered, and planted the seeds and beginnings of evil, he holds his ground. Teach self-denial and make its practice pleasurable, says Walter Scott, and you create for the world a destiny more sublime than ever issued from the brain of the wildest dreamer. Thomas A. Edison once asked why he was a total abstainer. He said, "I thought I had a better use for my head." Byron could write poetry easily, for it was merely indulging his natural propensity. But to curb his temper, soothe his discontent, and control his animal appetites was a very different thing. At all events, it seemed so great to him that he never seriously attempted self-conquest. Let every youth who would not be shipwrecked on life's voyage cultivate this one great virtue, self-control. There is nothing so important to a youth starting out in life as a thoroughly trained and cultivated will. Everything depends upon it. If he has it, he will succeed. If he does not have it, he will fail. The first and best of victories, says Plato, is for a man to conquer himself. To be conquered by himself is, of all things, the most shameful and vile. Silence, says Zimmermann, is the safest response for all the contradiction that arises from impertinence, vulgarity, or envy. He is a fool who cannot be angry, says English, but he is a wise man who will not. Seneca, one of the greatest of the ancient philosophers, said that we should every night call ourselves to account. What infirmity have I mastered today? What passion opposed? What temptation resisted? What virtue acquired? And then he follows with the profound truth that our vices will abate of themselves if they be brought every day to the shrift. If you cannot at first control your anger, learn to control your tongue, which, like fire, is a good servant but a hard master. It does no good to get angry. Some sins have a seeming compensation or apology, a present gratification of some sort, but anger has none. A man feels no better for it. It is really a torment, and when the storm of passion is cleared away, it leaves one to see that he has been a fool. And he has made himself a fool in the eyes of others too. The wife of Socrates, Xanthippe, was a woman of a most fantastical and furious spirit. At one time, having vented all the reproaches upon Socrates her fury could suggest, he went out and sat before the door. His calm and unconcerned behavior but irritated her so much the more, and, in the excess of her rage, she ran upstairs and emptied a vessel upon his head, at which he only laughed, and said that so much thunder must needs produce a shower. Alcibiades, his friend, talked with him about his wife, told him he wondered how he could bear such an everlasting scold in the same house with him. He replied, "I have so accustomed myself to expect it, that it now offends me no more than the noise of carriages in the street." It is said of Socrates that whether he was teaching the rules of an exact morality, whether he was answering his corrupt judges, or was receiving sentence of death, or swallowing the poison, he was still the same man, that is to say, calm, quiet, undisturbed, intrepid, in a word, wise to the last. It is not enough to have great qualities, says La Rochefoucauld. We should also have the management of them. No man can call himself educated until every voluntary muscle obeys his will. You ask whether it would not be manly to resent a great injury, said Eardley Wilmot. I answer that it would be manly to resent it, but it would be godlike to forgive it. He who, with strong passions, remains chaste, he who, keenly sensitive, with manly power of indignation in him, can be provoked, and yet restrain himself and forgive, these are strong men, the spiritual heroes. To feel provoked or exasperated at a trifle, when the nerves are exhausted, is perhaps natural to us in our imperfect state. But why put into the shape of speech the annoyance which, once uttered, is remembered, which may burn like a blistering wound, or rankle like a poisoned arrow? If a child be crying, or a friend capricious, or a servant unreasonable, be careful what you say. Do not speak while you feel the impulse of anger, for you will be almost certain to say too much, to say more than your cooler judgment will approve, and to speak in a way that you will regret. Be silent until the sweet by and by, when you will be calm, rested, and self-controlled. But self-respect must be accompanied by self-conquest, or our strong feelings may prove but runaway horses. He who would command others must first learn to obey, and he who would command his own powers must learn to be submissive to the still small voice within. Discipline the passions, curb pride and impatience, restrain all hasty impulses. Deny yourself the gratification of any desire not sanctioned by reason. Shame and its consequent degradation follow the loss of our own good opinion rather than the esteem of others. Too many yield in the perpetual conflict between temptation to gratify the coarser appetites and aspiration for the good, the true, and the beautiful. Voices unheard by those around us whisper, "Don't," but too often self-respect is lost, the will lies prostrate, and the debauch goes on. Such battles must be fought by all. Be ours the victory born of self-control, aided by that heaven which always helps him who prays while putting his own shoulder to the wheel. No man had a better heart or more thoroughly hated oppression than Edmund Burke. He possessed neither experience in affairs, nor a tranquil judgment, nor the rule over his own spirit, so that his genius, under the impulse of his bewildering passions, wrought much evil to his country and to Europe, even while he rendered noble service to the cause of commercial freedom, to Ireland and to America. Burns could not resist the temptation to utter his clever sarcasms at another's expense, and one of his biographers had said that he made 100 enemies for every 10 jokes he made. But Burns could no more control his appetite than his tongue. Thus thoughtless follies laid him low, and stained his name. Xantus, the philosopher, told his servant that on the morrow he was going to have some friends to dine, and asked him to get the best thing he could find in the market. The philosopher and his guests sat down the next day at the table. They had nothing but tongue, 4 or 5 courses of tongue cooked in this way and tongue cooked in that way, and the philosopher lost his patience, and said to his servant, "Didn't I tell you to get the best thing in the market?" He said, "I did get the best thing in the market. Isn't the tongue the organ of sociality, the organ of eloquence, the organ of kindness, the organ of worship?" Then Xantus said, "Tomorrow I want you to get the worst thing in the market." And on the morrow the philosopher sat at the table, and there was nothing there but tongue. 4 or 5 courses of tongue in this shape and tongue in that shape, and the philosopher again lost his patience, and said, "Didn't I tell you to get the worst thing in the market?" The servant replied, "I did, for isn't the tongue the organ of blasphemy, the organ of defamation, the organ of lying?" "I can reform my people," said Peter the Great, "but I cannot reform myself." He forbade all Russians to wear beards, and to quell the insurrection which resulted. He had 8,000 revolters beheaded. With a hatchet he began the ghastly work. he had his own son beheaded. He who cannot resist temptation is not a man. He is wanting in the highest attributes of humanity. The honor and nobleness of the old knight errantry consisted in defending the innocence of men and protecting the chastity of women against the assaults of others. But the true and nobler knighthood protects the property and the character, the innocence and the chastity of others against one's self. We should all be posted upon our weak points, for after all there are many emergencies in life when these weak points, not our strong ones, will measure our manhood and our strength. Many a woman whom a mouse would frighten out of her wits would not shrink from assisting in terrible surgical operations in our city or war hospitals, and many an officer and soldier who would walk up to the cannon's mouth without a tremor in battle would not dare to say his soul was his own in a society parlor. Many a great statesman has quailed before the ringer of scorn of a fellow congressman, and has been completely cowed by a hiss from the gallery or a ridiculing paragraph in a newspaper. We all have tender spots, weak spots, and a man can never know his strength who does not study his weaknesses. Violent passions and ardent feelings are seldom found united with complete self-command. But when they are, they form the strongest possible character, for there is all the power of clear thought and cool judgment impelled by the resistless energy of feeling. This combination Washington possessed, for in his impetuosity there was no foolish rashness, and in his passion no injustice. Besides, whatever violence there might be within, the explosion seldom came to the surface, and when it did it was arrested at once by the stern mandate of his will. He never lost the mastery of himself in any emergency, and in ruling his spirit showed himself greater than in taking a city. It is one of the astonishing things in his life that, amid the perfect chaos of feeling into which he was thrown, amid the distracted counsels and still more distracted affairs that surrounded him, he never once lost the perfect equilibrium of his own mind. The contagion of fear and doubt and despair could not touch him. He did not seem susceptible to the common influences which affect men. His soul, poised on its own center, reposed calmly there through all the storms that beat for 7 years on his noble breast. The ingratitude and folly of those who should have been his allies, the insults of his foes, and the frowns of fortune never provoked him into a rash act, or deluded him into a single error. Horace Mann says that there must be a time when the vista of the future, with all its possibilities of glory and of shame, first opens to the vision of youth. Then he is summoned to make his choice between truth and treachery, between honor and dishonor, between purity and profligacy, between moral life and moral death. And as he doubts or balances between the heavenward or hellward course, as he struggles to rise or consents to fall, is there in all the universe of God a spectacle of higher exaltation or of deeper pathos? Within him are the appetites of a brute and the attributes of an angel. And when these meet in council to make up the roll of his destiny and seal his fate, shall the beast hound out the seraph? Shall the young man, now conscious of the largeness of his sphere and of the sovereignty of his choice, wed the low ambitions of the world, and seek, with their emptiness, to fill his immortal desires? Because he has a few animal wants that must be supplied, shall he become all animal, epicure and an inebriate, and blasphemously make it the first doctrine of his catechism, the chief end of man, to glorify his stomach and enjoy it? Because it is the law of self-preservation that he shall provide for himself, and the law of religion that he shall provide for his family, when he has one, must he, therefore, cut away all the bonds of humanity that bind him to his race, forswear charity, crush down every prompting of benevolence, and if he can have the palace of equipage of the prince and the table of a sybarite, become a blind man and a deaf man and a dumb man when he walks the streets where hunger moans and nakedness shivers? The strong man is the one who ever keeps himself under strict discipline, who never once allows the lower to usurp the place of the higher in him, who makes his passions his servants and never allows them to be his master, who is ever led by his mind and not by his inclinations. He drills and disciplines his desires, and keeps the roots of his life underground, and never allows them to interfere with his character. He is never the slave of his inclinations, nor the sport of impulse. He is the commander of himself, and heads his ship due north even in the wildest tempests of passion. He is never the slave of his strongest desire. A noted teacher has said that the propensities and habits are as teachable as Latin and Greek, while they are infinitely more essential to happiness. We are very largely the creatures of our wills. By constantly looking on the bright side of things, by viewing everything hopefully, by setting the face as a flint every hour of every day toward all that is harmonious and beautiful in life, and refusing to listen to the discord or to look at the ugly side of life, by constantly directing the thought toward what is noble, grand and true, we can soon form habits which will develop into a beautiful character, a harmonious and well-rounded life. We are creatures of habit, and by knowing the laws of its formation we can, in a little while, build up a network of habit about us, which will protect us from most of the ugly, selfish, and degrading things of life. In fact, the only real happiness and unalloyed satisfaction we get out of life is the product of self-control. It is the great guardian of all the virtues, without which none of them is safe. It is the sentinel which stands on guard at the door of life, to admit friends and exclude enemies. "I call that mind free," says Channing, "which jealously guards its intellectual rights and powers, which calls no man master, which does not content itself with a passive or hereditary faith, which opens itself to light whence soever it may come, which receives new truth as an angel from heaven, which, whilst consulting others, inquires still more of the oracle within itself, and uses instruction from abroad, not to supersede, but to quicken and exalt its own energies. I call that mind free which is not passively framed by outward circumstances, which is not swept away by the torrent of events, which is not the creature of accidental impulse, but which bends events to its own improvement, and acts from an inward spring, from immutable principles which it has deliberately espoused. I call that mind free which protects itself against the usurpations of society, which does not cower to human opinion, which feels itself accountable to a higher tribunal than man's, which respects a higher law than fashion, which respects itself too much to be the slave or tool of the many or the few. I call that mind free, which, through confidence in God and in the power of virtue, has cast off all fear but that of wrongdoing, which no menace or peril can enthrall, which is calm in the midst of tumults, and possesses itself though all else be lost. I call that mind free which resists the bondage of habit, which does not mechanically repeat itself and copy the past, which does not live on its old virtues, which does not enslave itself to precise rules, but which forgets what is behind, listens for new and higher monitions of conscience, and rejoices to pour itself forth in fresh and higher exertions. I call that mind free which is jealous of its own freedom, which guards itself from being merged in others, which guards its empire over itself as nobler than the empire of the world. End of chapter 16.
How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 17. Stick. Patience is the courage of the conqueror. It is the virtue par excellence of man against destiny, of the one against the world, and of the soul against matter. Therefore this is the courage of the gospel, and its importance, in a social view, its importance to races and institutions, cannot be too earnestly inculcated. Bulwer. Perpetual pushing and assurance put a difficulty out of countenance, and make a seeming impossibility give way. Jeremy Collier. To bear is to conquer fate. Campbell. The nerve that never relaxes, the eye that never blenches, the thought that never wanders, these are the masters of victory. Burke. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. Longfellow. How long did it take you to learn to play? Asked a young man of Gerardini. 12 hours a day for 20 years, replied the great violinist. Laman Beecher's father, when asked how long it took him to write his celebrated sermon on the government of God, replied, about 40 years. "If you will study a year, I will teach you to sing well," said an Italian music teacher to a pupil who wished to know what can be hoped for with study. "If 2 years, you may excel. If you will practice the scale constantly for 3 years, I will make you the best tenor in Italy. If for 4 years, you may have the world at your feet." Perceiving that Caffarelli had a fine tenor voice and unusual talent, a teacher offered to give him a thorough musical education free of charge, provided the pupil would promise never to complain of the course of instruction given. The first year the master gave nothing but the scales, compelling the youth to practice them over and over again. The second year it was the same, the third, and the fourth, the conditions of the bargain being the only reply to any question in relation to a change from such monotonous drill. The fifth year the teacher introduced chromatics and thorough bass, and at its close, when Caffarelli looked for something more brilliant and interesting, the master said, "Go, my son, I can teach you nothing more. You are the first singer of Italy and of the world." The mastery of scales and diatonics gave him power to sing anything. "Keep at the helm," said President Porter. "Steer your own ship, and remember that the great art of commanding is to take a fair share of the work. Strike out, assume your own position. Put potatoes in a cart over a rough road, and the small ones go to the bottom." "Never depend upon your genius," said John Ruskin in the words of Joshua Reynolds. "If you have talent, industry will improve it. If you have none, industry will supply the deficiency." "The only merit to which I lay claim," said Hugh Miller, "is that of patient research. A merit in which whoever wills may rival or surpass me. And this humble faculty of patience, when rightly developed, may lead to more extraordinary development of ideas than even genius itself." Titian, the greatest master of color the world has seen, used to say, "White, red, and black, these are all the colors that a painter needs, but he must know how to use them." It took 50 years of constant hard practice to bring him to his full mastery. "How much grows everywhere if we do but wait!" exclaims Carlyle. "Not a difficulty but can transfigure itself into a triumph. Not even a deformity but if our own soul have imprinted worth on it will grow dear to us." Persistency is characteristic of all men who have accomplished anything great. They may lack in some other particular, have many weaknesses or eccentricities, but the quality of persistence is never absent in a successful man. No matter what opposition he meets, or what discouragements overtake him, he is always persistent. Drudgery cannot disgust him. Obstacles cannot discourage him. Labor cannot weary him. He will persist, no matter what comes or what goes. It is a part of his nature. He could almost as easily stop breathing. It is not so much brilliancy of intellect or fertility of resource as persistency of effort, constancy of purpose, that makes a great man. Persistency always gives confidence. Everybody believes in the man who persists. He may meet misfortunes, sorrows, and reverses, but everybody believes that he will ultimately triumph because they know there is no keeping him down. Does he keep at it? Is he persistent? is the question which the world asks of a man. Even the man with small ability will often succeed if he has the quality of persistence, where a genius without persistence would fail. How hard I worked at that tremendous shorthand, and all improvement appertaining to it, said Dickens. I will only add to what I have already written of my perseverance at this time of my life, and of a patient and continuous energy which then began to be matured within me, and which I know to be the strong point of my character, if it have any strength at all, that there, on looking back, I find the source of my success. I am sorry to say that I don't think this is in your line, said Woodfall the reporter, after Sheridan had made his first speech in Parliament. You had better have stuck to your former pursuits. With his head on his hand, Sheridan mused for a time, then looked up and said, "It is in me, and it shall come out of me." From the same man came that harangue against Warren Hastings, which the orator Fox called the best speech ever made in the House of Commons. "The man who is perpetually hesitating which of two things he will do first," said William Wirt, "will do neither. The man who resolves, but suffers his resolution to be changed by the first counter-suggestion of a friend, who fluctuates from opinion to opinion, from plan to plan, and veers like a weathercock to every point of the compass, with every breath of caprice that blows, can never accomplish anything great or useful. Instead of being progressive in anything, he will be at best stationary, and more probably retrograde in all." Great writers have ever been noted for their tenacity of purpose. Their works have not been flung off from minds aglow with genius, but have been elaborated and elaborated into grace and beauty, until every trace of their efforts has been obliterated. Bishop Butler worked 20 years incessantly on his Analogy, and even then was so dissatisfied that he wanted to burn it. Rousseau says he obtained the ease and grace of his style only by ceaseless inquietude, by endless botches and erasures. Virgil worked 11 years on the Aeneid. The notebooks of great men like Hawthorne and Emerson are telltales of enormous drudgery, of the years put into a book which may be read in an hour. Montesquieu was 25 years writing his Esprit de Loi, yet you can read it in 60 minutes. Adam Smith spent 10 years on his Wealth of Nations. A rival playwright once laughed at Euripides for spending 3 days on 3 lines, when he had written 500 lines. But your 500 lines in 3 days will be dead and forgotten, while my 3 lines will live forever, replied Euripides. Sir Fowell Buxton thought he could do as well as others if he devoted twice as much time and labor as they did. Ordinary means and extraordinary application have done most of the great things in the world. Defoe offered the manuscript of Robinson Crusoe to many booksellers, and all but one refused it. Addison's first play, Rosamond, was hissed off the stage, but the editor of the Spectator and Tatler was made of stern stuff, and was determined that the world should listen to him, and it did. David Livingstone said, "Those who have never carried a book through the press can form no idea of the amount of toil it involves. The process has increased my respect for authors 1,000-fold. I think I would rather cross the African continent again than undertake to write another book." "For the statistics of the Negro population of South America alone," says Robert Dale Owen, "I examined more than 150 volumes. Another author tells us that he wrote paragraphs and whole pages of his book as many as 50 times. It is said of one of Longfellow's poems that it was written in 4 weeks, but that he spent 6 months in correcting and cutting it down. Bulwer declared that he had written some of his briefer productions as many as 8 or 9 times before their publication. One of Tennyson's pieces was rewritten 50 times. John Owen was 20 years on his commentary on the Epistle to the Hebrews, Gibbon on his Decline and Fall 20 years, and Adam Clarke on his commentary 26 years. Carlyle spent 15 years on his Frederick the Great. A great deal of time is consumed in reading before some books are prepared. George Eliot read 1,000 books before she wrote Daniel Deronda. Alison read 2,000 before he completed his history. It is said of another that he read 20,000 and wrote only 2 books. Virgil spent several years on the Georgics, which could be printed in 2 columns of an ordinary newspaper. Generally speaking, said Sidney Smith, the life of all truly great men has been a life of intense and incessant labor. They have commonly passed the first half of life in the gross darkness of indigent humility, overlooked, mistaken, condemned by weaker men, thinking while others slept, reading while others rioted, feeling something within them that told them that they should not always be kept down among the dregs of the world. And then, when their time has come, and some little accident has given them their first occasion, they have burst out into the light and glory of public life, rich with the spoils of time, and mighty in all the labors and struggles of the mind. Malibran said, "If I neglect my practice a day, I see the difference in my execution. If for 2 days, my friends see it. And if for a week, all the world knows my failure." Constant, persistent struggle she found to be the price of her marvelous power. "If I am building a mountain," said Confucius, "and stop before the last basketful of earth is placed on the summit, I have failed." "Young gentlemen," said Francis Wayland, "remember that nothing can stand day's work." America will never produce any great art until our resources are developed and we get more time. As a people we have not yet learned the art of patience. We do not know how to wait. Think of an American artist spending 7, 8, 10, and even 12 years on a single painting, as did Titian, Michelangelo, and many of the other old masters. Think of an American sculptor spending years and years upon a single masterpiece, as did the Greeks and Romans. We have not yet learned the secret of working and waiting. "The single element in all the progressive movements of my pencil," said the great David Wilkie, "was persevering industry." The kind of ability which most men rank highest is that which enables its possessor to do what he undertakes and attain the object of his ambition or desire. The reader of a newspaper does not see the first insertion of an ordinary advertisement, says a French writer. The second insertion he sees but does not read. The third insertion he reads. The fourth insertion he looks at the price. The fifth insertion he speaks of it to his wife. The sixth insertion he is ready to purchase, and the seventh insertion he purchases. The large fees which make us envy the great lawyer or doctor are not remuneration for the few minutes' labor of giving advice. but for the mental stores gathered during the precious spare moments of many a year while others were sleeping or enjoying holidays. A client will frequently object to paying $50 for an opinion written in 5 minutes. But such an opinion could be written only by one who has read 100 law books. If the lawyer had not previously read those books, but should keep a client waiting until he could read them with care, there would be fewer complaints that fees of this kind are not earned. We are told that Perseverance built the pyramids on Egypt's plains, erected the gorgeous temple at Jerusalem, enclosed in adamant the Chinese Empire, scaled the stormy cloud-capped Alps, opened a highway through the watery wilderness of the Atlantic, leveled the forests of the New World, and reared in its stead a community of states and nations. Perseverance has wrought from the marble block the exquisite creations of genius, painted on canvas the gorgeous mimicry of nature, and engraved on a metallic surface the viewless substance of the shadow. Perseverance has put in motion millions of spindles, winged as many flying shuttles, harnessed thousands of iron steeds to as many freighted cars, and sent them flying from town to town and nation to nation, tunneled mountains of granite, and annihilated space with the lightning's speed. Perseverance has whitened the waters of the world with the sails of 100 nations, navigated every sea, and explored every land. Perseverance has reduced nature in her 1,000 forms to as many sciences, taught her laws, prophesied her future movements, measured her untrodden spaces, counted her myriad hosts of worlds, and computed their distances, dimensions, and velocities. Whoever is resolved to excel in painting, or indeed in any other art, said Reynolds, must bring all his mind to bear upon that one object from the moment that he rises till he goes to bed. If you work hard 2 weeks without selling a book, wrote a publisher to an agent, you will make a success of it. Know thy work and do it, said Carlyle, and work at it like a Hercules. One monster there is in the world, an idle man. End of chapter 17.
How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 18. Save. If you want to test a young man and ascertain whether nature made him for a king or a subject, give him $1,000 and see what he will do with it. If he is born to conquer and command, he will put it quietly away till he is ready to use it as opportunity offers. If he is born to serve, he will immediately begin to spend it in gratifying his ruling propensity. Parton. The man who builds and lacks wherewith to pay, provides a home from which to run away. Young. Buy what thou hast no need of, and ere long thou shalt sell thy necessaries. For age and want save while you may. No morning sun lasts a whole day. Franklin. Whatever be your talents, whatever be your prospects, never speculate away on a chance of a palace that which you might need as a provision against the workhouse. Bulwer. What do you do with all these books? Oh, that library is my 1 cigar a day, was the response. What do you mean? Mean? Just this. When you bothered me about being a man and learning to smoke, I'd just been reading about a young fellow who bought books with money that others would have spent in smoke, and I thought I'd try and do the same. You remember, I said I should allow myself 1 cigar a day. Yes. Well, I never smoked. I just put by the price of a 5-cent cigar every day, and as the money accumulated I bought books, the books you see there. Do you mean to say that those books cost no more than that? Why, there are dollars worth of them. Yes, I know there are. I had 6 years more of my apprenticeship to serve when you persuaded me to be a man. I put by the money I have told you of, which of course at 5 cents a day amounted to $18.25 a year, or $109.50 in 6 years. I keep those books by themselves, as a result of my apprenticeship cigar money, and if you'd done as I did, you would by this time have saved many, many more dollars than that, and been in business besides. If a man will begin at the age of 20 and lay by 26 cents every working day, investing at 7% compound interest, he will have $32,000 when he is 70 years old. 20 cents a day is no unusual expenditure for beer or cigars, yet in 50 years it would easily amount to $20,000. Even a saving of $1 a week from the date of one's majority would give him $1,000 for each of the last 10 of the allotted years of life. What maintains one vice would bring up 2 children. Who does not feel honored by his relationship to Dr. Franklin, whether as a townsman or a countryman, or even as belonging to the same race? Who does not feel a sort of personal complacency in that frugality of his youth which laid the foundation for so much competence and generosity in his mature age? In that wise discrimination of his outlays, which held the culture of the soul in absolute supremacy over the pleasures of the sense, and in that consummate mastership of the great art of living, which has carried his practical wisdom into every cottage in Christendom, and made his name immortal? And yet how few there are among us who would not disparage, nay, ridicule and contemn a young man who should follow Franklin's example. Washington examined the minutest expenditures of his family, even when President of the United States. He understood that without economy none can be rich, and with it none need be poor. Napoleon examined his domestic bills himself, detected overcharges and errors. Unfortunately, Congress can pass no law that will remedy the vice of living beyond one's means. We are ruined, says Colton, not by what we really want, but by what we think we do. Therefore, never go abroad in search of your wants. If they be real wants, they will come home in search of you. For he that buys what he does not want will soon want what he cannot buy. I hope that there will not be another sale, exclaimed Horace Walpole, for I have not an inch of room nor a farthing left. A woman once bought an old door plate with Thompson on it, because she thought it might come in handy sometime. The habit of buying what you don't need because it is cheap encourages extravagance. Many have been ruined by buying good pennyworths. Barnum tells the story of one of his acquaintances whose wife would have a new and elegant sofa, which in the end cost him $30,000. When the sofa reached the house it was found necessary to get chairs to match, then sideboards, carpets and tables to correspond with them, and so on through the entire stock of furniture, when at last it was found that the house itself was quite too small and old-fashioned for the furniture, and a new one was built to correspond with the sofa, and etceteras. Thus, added my friend, running up an outlay of $30,000 caused by that single sofa, and saddling on me in the shape of servants, equipage, and the necessary expenses attendant on keeping up a fine establishment, a yearly outlay of $11,000, and a habit of extravagance which was a constant menace to my prosperity. Cicero said, "Not to have a mania for buying is to possess a revenue." Many are carried away by the habit of bargain buying. Here's something wonderfully cheap, let's buy it. Have you any use for it? No, not at present, but it is sure to come in useful sometime. Annual income, says Micawber, £20 annual expenditure, 19.6 result happiness. Annual income £20 annual expenditure, £20 ought and 6 result misery. Hunger, rags, cold, hard work, contempt, suspicion, unjust reproach are disagreeable, says Horace Greeley, but debt is infinitely worse than them all. If I had but 50 cents a week to live on, said Greeley, I'd buy a peck of corn and parch it before I'd owe any man $1. To find out uses for the persons or things which are now wasted in life is to be the glorious work of the men of the next generation, and that which will contribute most to their enrichment. Economizing in spots or by freaks is no economy at all. It must be done by management. let us learn the meaning of economy. Economy is a high, humane office, a sacrament when its aim is great, when it is the prudence of simple tastes, when it is practiced for freedom or love or devotion. Much of the economy we see in houses is of a base origin, and is best kept out of sight. Parched corn eaten today that I may have roast fowl for my dinner on Sunday is a baseness, but parched corn and a house with one apartment, that I may be free of all perturbations, that I may be serene and docile to what the mind shall speak, and girt and road ready for the lowest mission of knowledge or good will, is frugality for gods and heroes. Like many other boys, P.T. Barnum picked up pennies driving oxen for his father. But unlike many other boys, he would invest these earnings in knickknacks which he would sell to others on every holiday, thus increasing his pennies to dollars. The eccentric John Randolph once sprang from his seat in the House of Representatives, and exclaimed in his piercing voice, "Mr. Speaker, I have found it!" And then, in the stillness which followed this strange outburst, he added, "I have found the philosopher's stone. It is pay as you go." In France, all classes, the men as well as the women, study the economy of cookery and practice it, and there, as many travelers affirm, the people live at 1/3 the expense of Englishmen or Americans. There they know how to make savory messes out of remnants that others would throw away. There they cook no more for each day than is required for that day. With them the art ranks with the fine arts, and a great cook is as much honored and respected as a sculptor or a painter. The consequence is, as ex-Secretary McCulloch thinks, a French village of 1,000 inhabitants could be supported luxuriously on the waste of one of our large American hotels, and he believes that the entire population of France could be supported on the food which is literally wasted in the United States. Professor Blott, who resided for some years in the United States, remarks pathetically that here, where the markets rival the best markets of Europe, it is really a pity to live as many do live. There are thousands of families in moderately good circumstances who have never eaten a loaf of really good bread, nor tasted a well-cooked steak, nor sat down to a properly prepared meal. There are many who think that economy consists in saving cheese parings and candle ends, in cutting off 2d. from the laundress bill, and doing all sorts of little, mean, dirty things. Economy is not meanness. The misfortune is also that this class of persons let their economy apply only in one direction. They fancy that they are so wonderfully economical in saving a halfpenny, where they ought to spend 2d., that they think they can afford to squander in other directions. Punch, in speaking of this one idea class of people, says, "They are like a man who bought a penny herring for his family's dinner, and then hired a coach and four to take it home. I never knew a man to succeed by practicing this kind of economy. True economy consists in always making the income exceed the outgo. Wear the old clothes a little longer, if necessary. Dispense with the new pair of gloves, live on plainer food if need be, so that under all circumstances, unless some unforeseen accident occurs, there will be a margin in favor of the income. A penny here and a dollar there placed at interest go on accumulating, and in this way the desired result is obtained." "I wish I could write all across the sky in letters of gold," says Rev. William Marsh, "the one word, Savings Bank." Boston savings banks have $130,000,000 on deposit, mostly saved in driblets. Josiah Quincy used to say that the servant girls built most of the palaces on Beacon Street. "Nature uses a grinding economy," says Emerson, "working up all that is wasted today into tomorrow's creation, not a superfluous grain of sand for all the ostentation she makes of expense and public works. She flung us out in her plenty, but we cannot shed a hair or a paring of a nail, but instantly she snatches at the shred and appropriates it to her general stock. Last summer's flowers and foliage decayed in autumn only to enrich the earth this year for other forms of beauty. Nature will not even wait for our friends to see us unless we die at home. The moment the breath has left the body, she begins to take us to pieces, that the parts may be used again for other creations. So apportion your wants that your means may exceed them, says Bulwer. With £100 a year I may need no man's help. I may at least have my crust of bread and liberty. But with £5,000 a year I may dread a ring at my bell. I may have my tyrannical master in servants whose wages I cannot pay. My exile may be at the fiat of the first long-suffering man who enters a judgment against me. For the flesh that lies nearest my heart some Shylock may be dusting his scales and whetting his knife. Every man is needy who spends more than he has. No man is needy who spends less. I may so ill manage that with £5,000 a year I purchase the worst evils of poverty, terror and shame. I may so well manage my money that with £100 a year I purchase the best blessings of wealth, safety and respect. End of chapter 18.
How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 19. Live Upward. Do what thou dost, as if the stake were heaven, and this thy last deed ere the judgment day. If you wish to reach the highest, begin at the lowest. Publius Syrius. What is a man, if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed? A beast, no more. Sure, he that made us with such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to rust in us unused. Shakespeare. Ambition is a spur that makes man struggle with destiny. It is heaven's own incentive to make purpose great and achievement greater. Anonymous. Not failure, but low aim is crime. Endeavour to be first in thy calling, whatever it may be. Neither let anyone go before thee in well-doing. Oh, may I join the choir invisible of those immortal dead who live again, in minds made better by their presence, live in pulses stirred to generosity, in deeds of daring rectitude, in scorn for miserable aims that end with self, in thoughts sublime that pierce the night like stars, and with their mild persistent urge man's search to vaster issues. George Eliot. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and myself have founded empires, said Napoleon to Montholon at St. Helena. But upon what did we rest the creations of our genius? Upon force. Jesus Christ alone founded his empire on love, and at this moment millions of men would die for him. I die before my time, and my body will be given back to worms. Such is the fate of him who has been called the great Napoleon. What an abyss between my deep misery and the eternal kingdom of Christ, which is proclaimed, loved, and adored, and which is extended over the whole earth. Call you this dying? Is it not rather living? The death of Christ is the death of a God. No true man can live a half-life, says Philip Brooks, when he has genuinely learnt that it is a half-life. The other half, the higher half, must haunt him. Ideality, says Horace Mann, is only the avant courier of the mind, and where that in a healthy and normal state goes, I hold it to be a prophecy that realization can follow. If the certainty of future fame bore Milton rejoicing through his blindness, or cheered Galileo in his dungeon, writes Bulwer, what stronger and holier support shall not be given to him who has loved mankind as his brothers and devoted his labours to their cause, who has not sought but relinquished his own renown, who has braved the present censures of men for their future benefit, and trampled upon glory in the energy of benevolence. Will there not be for him something more powerful than fame to comfort his sufferings and to sustain his hopes? If I live, wrote Rufus Choate in his diary in September of 1844, all blockheads which are shaken at certain mental peculiarities shall know and feel a reasoner, a lawyer, and a man of business. I have read that none of the humbler races have the muscle by which man turns his eye upward, though I am not anatomist enough to be sure of the fact. Show me a contented slave, says Burke, and I will show you a degraded man. They truly are faithful, says one writer, who devote their entire lives to amendment. General Grant said of the Chinese wall, I believe that the labour expended on this wall could have built every railroad in the United States, every canal and highway, and most, if not all, of our cities. The real benefactors of mankind, says Emerson, are the men and women who can raise their fellow beings out of the world of corn and money, who make them forget their bank account by interesting them in their higher selves, who can raise mere money getters into the intellectual realm, where they will cease to measure greatness and happiness by dollars and cents, who can make men forget their stomachs and feast on being's banquet. Men are not so much mistaken in desiring to advance themselves, said Beecher, as in judging what will be an advance, and what the right method of obtaining it. An ambition which has conscience in it will always be a laborious and faithful engineer, and will build the road and bridge the chasms between itself and the eminent success by the most faithful and minute performances of duty. The liberty to go higher than we are is given only when we have fulfilled amply the duty of our present sphere. Thus men are to rise upon their performances and not upon their discontent. And this is the secret and golden meaning of the command to be content in whatever sphere we are placed. It is not to be the content of indifference, of indolence, of unambitious stupidity, but the content of industrious fidelity. When men are building the foundations of vast structures, they must needs labour far below the surface, and in disagreeable conditions. But every course of stone which they lay raises them higher, and at length, when they reach the surface, they have laid such solid work under them that they need not fear now to carry up their walls through towering stories till they overlook the whole neighbourhood. A man proves himself fit to go higher who shows that he is faithful where he is. A man that will not do well in his present place because he longs to be higher is fit neither to be where he is or yet above it. He is already too high and should be put lower. Do that which is assigned thee, and thou canst not hope too much or dare too much. What a man does that he has, in himself, in his might, don't waste life on doubts and fears. Spend yourself on the work before you, well assured that the performance of this hour's duties will be the best preparation for the hours or ages that follow it. Tradition says that when Solomon received the gift of an emerald vase from the Queen of Sheba, he filled it with an elixir which he only knew how to prepare, one drop of which would prolong life indefinitely. A dying criminal begged for a drop of the precious fluid, but Solomon refused to prolong a wicked life. When good men asked for it, they were refused, or failed to obtain it when promised, as the king would forget or prefer not to open the vase to get but a single drop. When at last the king became ill and bade his servants bring the vase, he found that the contents had all evaporated. So it is often with our hope, our faith, our ambition, our aspiration. A man cannot aspire if he looks down. God has not created us with aspirations and longings for heights to which we cannot climb. Live upward. The unattained still beckons us towards the summit of life's mountains, into the atmosphere where great souls live and breathe and have their being. Even hope is but a promise of the possibility of its own fulfilment. Life should be lived in earnest. It is no idle game, no farce to amuse and be forgotten. It is a stern reality, fuller of duties than the sky of stars. You cannot have too much of that yearning which we call aspiration. For even though you do not attain your ideal, the efforts you make will bring nothing but blessing, while he who fails of attaining mere worldly goals is too often eaten up with the canker worm of disappointed ambition. To all will come a time when the love of glory will be seen to be but a splendid delusion, riches empty, rank vain, power dependent, and all outward advantages without inward peace a mere mockery of wretchedness. The wisest men have taken care to uproot selfish ambition from their breasts. Shakespeare considered it so near a vice as to need extenuating circumstances to make it a virtue. Who has not noticed the power of love in an awkward, crabbed, shiftless, lazy man? He becomes gentle, chaste in language, energetic. Love brings out the poetry in him. It is only an idea, a sentiment, and yet what magic it has wrought! Nothing we can see has touched the man, yet he is entirely transformed. Not less does ambition completely transform a human being, for a woman thirsting for fame can work where a man equally resolute would faint. He despises ease and sloth, welcomes toil and hardship, and shakes even kingdoms to gratify his master passion. Mere ambition has impelled many a man to a life of eminence and usefulness. Its higher manifestation, aspiration, has led him beyond the stars. If the aim be right, the life in its details cannot be far wrong. Your heart must inspire what your hands execute, or the work will be poorly done. The hand cannot reach higher than does the heart. But do not strive to reach impossible goals. It is wholly in your power to develop yourself, but not necessarily so to make yourself a king. How many presidents of the United States or prime ministers of England are chosen within the working lifetime of a man? What if 1,000 young men resolve to become president or prime minister? While such prizes are within your reach, remember that your will must be tremendous and your qualifications of the highest order, or you cannot hope to secure them. Too many are deluded by ambition beyond their power of attainment, or tortured by aspirations totally disproportionate to their capacity for execution. You may indeed confidently hope to become eminent in usefulness and power, but only as you build upon a broad foundation of self-culture, while as a rule specialists in ambition, as in science, are apt to become narrow and one-sided. Darwin was very fond of poetry and music when young, but after devoting his life to science, he was surprised to find Shakespeare tedious. He said that if he were to live his life again, he would read poetry and hear music every day, so as not to lose the power of appreciating such things. God asks no man whether he will accept life. That is not the choice. You must take it. The only choice is how. When I found out I was black, said Dumas, I resolved to live as if I were white, and so force men to look below my skin. In the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society is a prospectus used by Longfellow in canvassing, on one of the blank leaves of which are the skeleton stanzas of Excelsior, which he was evidently evolving as he trudged from house to house. Disregarding the honours that most men value, and looking to the truth, said Plato, I shall endeavour in reality to live as virtuously as I can, and when I die, to die so, and I invite all other men to the utmost of my power, and you too I invite this contest, which, I affirm, surpasses all contests here. Did you ever hear of a man who had striven all his life faithfully and singly toward an object, and in no measure obtained it? Asked Thoreau. If a man constantly aspires, is he not elevated? Did ever a man try heroism, magnanimity, truth, and sincerity, and find there was no advantage in them, that it was a vain endeavour? Oh, if the stone can only have some vision of the temple of which it is to be a part for ever, exclaimed Phillips Brooks. What patience must fill it as it feels the blows of the hammer, and knows that success for it is simply to let itself be wrought into what shape the master wills. Man never reaches heights above his habitual thought. It is not enough now and then to mount on wings of ecstasy into the infinite. We must habitually dwell there. The great man is he who abides easily on heights to which others rise occasionally and with difficulty. Don't let the maxims of low prudence daily dinned into your ears lower the tone of your high ambition, or check your aspirations. Hope lifts us step by step up the mysterious ladder, the top of which no eye hath ever seen. Though we do not find what hope promised, yet we are stronger for the climbing, and we get a broader outlook upon life, which repays the effort. Indeed, if we do not follow where hope beckons, we gradually slide down the ladder in despair. Strive ever to be at the top of your condition. A high standard is absolutely necessary. End of chapter 19.
How to Succeed, or Stepping Stones to Fame and Fortune, by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 20. Sand. I shall show the cinders of my spirits through the ashes of my chance. Shakespeare. Perseverance is a virtue that wins each godlike act, and plucks success even from the spear-proofed crest of rugged danger. William Harvard. Never say fail again. Richelieu. It is the one neck nearer that wins the race and shows the blood. the one pull more of the oar that proves the beefiness of the fellow, as Oxford men say. It is the one march more that wins the campaign, the 5 minutes more persistent courage that wins the fight. Though your force be less than another's, you equal and outmaster your opponent if you continue it longer and concentrate it more. Smiles. I know no such unquestionable badge and ensign of a sovereign mind as that tenacity of purpose which through all changes of companions or parties or fortunes, changes never, bates no jot of heart or hope, but wearies out opposition, and arrives at its port. "Well done, Tommy Brooks!" exclaimed his teacher in pleased surprise, when the dunce of the school spoke his piece without omitting a single word. The other boys had laughed when he rose, for they expected a bad failure. But when the rest of the class had tried, the teacher said Tommy had done the best of all, and gave him the prize. "And now tell me," said she, "how you learned the poem so well." "Please, ma'am, it was the snail on the wall that taught me how to do it," said Tommy. At this the other pupils laughed aloud, but the teacher said, "You need not laugh, boys, for we may learn much from such things as snails. How did the snail teach you, Tommy?" "I saw it crawl up the wall, little by little," replied the boy. "It did not stop nor turn back, but went on and on. And I thought I would do the same with the poem. So I learned it little by little, and did not give up. By the time the snail reached the top of the wall, I had learned the whole poem." I may here impart the secret of what is called good and bad luck, said Addison. There are men who, supposing Providence to have an implacable spite against them, bemoan in the poverty of old age the misfortunes of their lives. Luck forever runs against them and for others. One with a good profession lost his luck in the river, where he idled away his time a-fishing. Another with a good trade perpetually burnt up his luck by his hot temper, which provoked all his employees to leave him. Another with a lucrative business lost his luck by amazing diligence at everything but his own business. Another who steadily followed his trade, as steadily followed the bottle. Another who was honest and constant to his work, erred by his perpetual misjudgment. He lacked discretion. Hundreds lose their luck by indulging sanguine expectations, by trusting fraudulent men, and by dishonest gains. A man never has good luck who has a bad wife. I never knew an early rising, hard working, prudent man, careful of his earnings and strictly honest, who complained of his bad luck. A good character, good habits, and iron industry are impregnable to the assaults of the ill luck that fools are dreaming of. But when I see a tatterdemalion creeping out of a grocery late in the forenoon, with his hands stuck into his pockets, the rim of his hat turned up and the crown knocked in, I know he has had bad luck, for the worst of all luck is to be a sluggard, a knave, or a tippler. "You have a difficult subject," said Anthony Trollope at Niagara Falls to an artist who had attempted to draw the spray of the waters. "All subjects are difficult," was the reply, "to a man who desires to do well." "But yours, I fear, is impossible," said Trollope. "You have no right to say so, till I have finished my picture," protested the artist. "Tell Louisa to stick to her teaching. She can never succeed as a writer." When her father delivered the rejected manuscript of a story sent to James T. Fields, editor of the Atlantic Monthly, with the above message, Miss Alcott said, "Tell him I will succeed as a writer, and some day I shall write for the Atlantic." Not long after, she sent an article to the Atlantic and received a check for $50. With the money, she said, she bought a second-hand carpet for the parlor, a bonnet for her sister, shoes and stockings for herself. Her father was calling upon Longfellow some time after this, when Longfellow took the Atlantic and said, "I want to read to you Emerson's fine poem upon Thoreau's flute." Mr. Alcott interrupted him with delight and said, "My daughter Louisa wrote that." Men talk as if victory were something fortunate, says Emerson. Work is victory. Wherever work is done, victory is obtained. There is no chance and no blanks. You want but one verdict. If you have your own, you are secure of the rest. But if witnesses are wanted, witnesses are near. Young gentlemen, says Francis Wayland, remember that nothing can stand day's work. Alexander the Great exclaimed to his soldiers, disaffected after a long campaign, "Go home, and tell them that you left Alexander to conquer the world alone." "We discount only our own bills, and not those of private persons," said the cashier of the Bank of England, when a large bill was drawn by Anselm Rothschild of Frankfort, on Nathan Rothschild of London. "Private persons!" exclaimed Nathan, when told of the cashier's remark. "I will make these gentlemen see what sort of private persons we are." 3 weeks later he presented a £5 note at the bank at the opening of the office. The teller counted out 5 sovereigns, looking surprised that Baron Rothschild should have troubled himself about such a trifle. The Baron examined the coins one by one, weighing them in the balance, as he said the law gave him the right to do, put them into a little canvas bag, and offered a second, and then a third, fourth, 50th, 1000th note. When a bag was full, he handed it to a clerk in waiting, and proceeded to fill another. In 7 hours he had changed £21,000, and with 9 employees of his house similarly engaged, had occupied the tellers so busily in changing $1,050,000 worth of notes that no one else could receive attention. The bankers laughed, but the next morning Rothschild appeared with his 9 clerks and several drays to carry away the gold, remarking, "These gentlemen refuse to pay my bills. I have sworn not to keep theirs. They can pay at their leisure, only I notify them that I have enough to employ them for 2 months." The smiles faded from the features of the bank officials as they thought of a draft of $55,000,000 in gold which they did not hold. Next morning notice was given in the newspapers that the Bank of England would pay Rothschild's bills as well as its own. "Well," said Barnum to a friend in 1841, "I am going to buy the American Museum." "Buy it!" exclaimed the astonished friend, who knew that the showman had not a dollar. "What do you intend buying it with?" "Brass," was the prompt reply, "for silver and gold have I none." Everyone interested in public entertainments in New York knew Barnum, and knew the condition of his pocket. But Francis Olmsted, who owned the museum building, consulted numerous references, all telling of "a good showman who would do as he agreed," and accepted a proposition to give security for the purchaser. Mr. Olmsted was to appoint a money taker at the door, and credit Barnum toward the purchase with all above expenses and an allowance of $50 per month to support his wife and 3 children. Mrs. Barnum gladly assented to the arrangement, and offered, if need be, to cut down the household expenses to a little more than $1 a day. Some 6 months later Mr. Olmsted happened to enter the ticket office at noon, and found Barnum eating for dinner a few slices of bread and some corned beef. "Is this the way you eat your dinner?" he asked. "I have not eaten a warm dinner since I bought the museum, except on the Sabbath. And I intend never to eat another until I get out of debt." "Ah, you are safe, and will pay for the museum before the year is out," said Mr. Olmsted, slapping the young man approvingly on the shoulder. He was right, for in less than a year Barnum had paid every cent out of the profits of the establishment. A noted philosopher said, "The favors of fortune are like steep rocks. Only eagles and creeping things mount to the summit." Lord Campbell, who became Chief Justice and Lord Chancellor of England, and amassed a large fortune, began life as a drudge in a printing office. A little observation shows us that, as a rule, the men who accomplish the most in the world are the most useful and sensible members of society, the men who are depended upon most in emergencies, the men of backbone and stamina, the bone and sinew of their communities, the men who can always be relied upon, who are healthiest and happiest, are, as a rule, of ordinary mental caliber and medium capacity, but with persistent and untiring industry, these are they, after all, who carry the burdens and reap the prizes of life. It is the men and women who keep everlastingly at it, who do not believe themselves geniuses, but who know that if they ever accomplish anything great, they must do it by common drudgery and persistent industry, and with an unwavering aim in one pursuit. Those who believe themselves geniuses are apt to scatter their efforts and thus fritter away their great energies without accomplishing anything in proportion to their high promise. Often the men who promise the most pay the least. Mrs. Frank Leslie often refers to the time she lived in her carpetless attic while striving to pay her husband's obligations. She has fought her way successfully through 9 lawsuits and has paid the entire debt. She manages her 10 publications entirely herself, signs all checks and money orders, makes all contracts, looks over all proofs, and approves the makeup of everything before it goes to press. She has developed great business ability which no one dreamed she possessed. A little boy was asked how he learned to skate. "Oh, by getting up every time I fell down," he replied. The boy Thorwaldsen, whose father died in the poorhouse, and whose education was so scanty that he had to write his letters over many times before they could be posted, by his indomitable perseverance, tenacity, and grit, fascinated the world with the genius which neither his discouraging father, poverty, nor hardship could repress. "It is all very well," said Charles J. Fox, "to tell me that a young man has distinguished himself by a brilliant first speech. He may go on, or he may be satisfied with his first triumph. But show me a man who has not succeeded at first, and nevertheless has gone on, and I will back that young man to do better than most of those who have succeeded at the first trial." It was the last 3 days of the first voyage of Columbus that told. All his years of struggle and study would have availed nothing if he had yielded to the mutiny. It was all in those 3 days. But what days! "Often defeated in battle," said Macaulay of Alexander the Great, "he was always successful in war." He might have said the same of Washington, and, with appropriate changes, of all who win great triumphs of any kind. One of the greatest preachers of modern times, Lacordaire, failed again and again. Everybody said he would never make a preacher, but he was determined to succeed, and in 2 years from his humiliating failures he was preaching in Notre Dame to immense congregations. Orange Judd was a remarkable example of success through grit. He earned corn by working for farmers, carried it on his back to mill, brought back the meal to his room, cooked it himself, milked cows for his pint of milk per day, and lived on mush and milk for months together. He worked his way through Wesleyan University and took a 3 years postgraduate course at Yale. Oh, the triumphs of this indomitable spirit of the conqueror! This it was that enabled Franklin to dine on a small loaf in the printing office with a book in his hand. It helped Locke to live on bread and water in a Dutch garret. It enabled Gideon Lee to go barefoot in the snow, half-starved and thinly clad. It sustained Lincoln and Garfield on their hard journeys from the log cabin to the White House. The very reputation of being strong-willed, plucky, and indefatigable is of priceless value. It often cows enemies, and dispels at the start opposition to one's undertakings which would otherwise be formidable. When you get into a tight place and everything goes against you, till it seems as if you could not hold on a minute longer, said Harriet Beecher Stowe, never give up then, for that's just the place and time that the tide'll turn. Never despair, says Burke, but if you do, work on in despair. Once, when Marshal Ney was going into battle, looking down at his knees which were smiting together, he said, "You may well shake. You would shake worse yet if you knew where I am going to take you." "Go it, William," an old boxer was overheard saying to himself in the midst of a fight. "At him again. Never say die." A striking incident is related of the early experience of George Law, who in his day was one of the most conspicuous financiers and capitalists of New York City. When he was a young man, he went to New York, poor and friendless. One day he was walking along the streets, hungry, not knowing where his next meal would come from, and passed a new building in course of erection. Through some accident one of the hod carriers fell from the structure and dropped dead at his feet. Young Law, in his desperation, applied for the job to take the dead man's place, and the place was given him. He went to work, and this was how one of the wealthiest and shrewdest New York businessmen got his start. See young Disraeli, sprung from a hated and persecuted race, without opportunity, pushing his way up through the middle classes, up through the upper classes, until he stands self-poised upon the topmost round of political and social power. Scoffed, ridiculed, rebuffed, hissed from the House of Commons, he simply says, "The time will come when you will hear me." The time did come, and the boy with no chance swayed the scepter of England for a quarter of a century. If impossibilities ever exist, popularly speaking, they ought to have been found somewhere between the birth and the death of Kitto, that deaf pauper and master of Oriental learning. But Kitto did not find them there. In the presence of his decision and imperial energy, they melted away. Kitto begged his father to take him out of the poorhouse, even if he had to subsist like the Hottentots. He told him that he would sell his books and pawn his handkerchief, by which he thought he could raise about 12 shillings. He said he could live upon blackberries, nuts, and field turnips, and was willing to sleep on a hayrick. Here was real grit. What were impossibilities to such a resolute will? Patrick Henry voiced that decision which characterized the great men of the Revolution when he said, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Look at Garrison reading this advertisement in a Southern paper. $5,000 will be paid for the head of W.L. Garrison by the governor of Georgia. Behold him again. A broadcloth mob is leading him through the streets of Boston by a rope. He is hurried to jail. See him return calmly and unflinchingly to his work, beginning at the point at which he was interrupted. Note this heading in The Liberator, the type of which he set himself in an attic on State Street in Boston. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Was Garrison heard? Ask a race set free largely by his efforts. Even the gallows erected in front of his own door did not daunt him. He held the ear of an unwilling world with that burning word, freedom, which was destined never to cease its vibrations until it had breathed its sweet secret to the last slave. At a time when abolitionists were dangerously unpopular, a crowd of brawny Cape Cod fishermen had made such riotous demonstrations that all the speakers announced, except Stephen Foster and Lucy Stone, had fled from an open-air platform. "You had better run, Stephen," said she. "They are coming." "But who will take care of you?" asked Foster. "This gentleman will take care of me," she replied, calmly laying her hand within the arm of a burly rioter with a club, who had just sprung upon the platform. "What did you say?" stammered the astonished rowdy, as he looked at the little woman. "Yes, I'll take care of you, and no one shall touch a hair of your head." With this, he forced a way for her through the crowd, and at her earnest request, placed her upon a stump, and stood guard with his club while she delivered an address so effective that the audience offered no further violence, and even took up a collection of $20 to repay Mr. Foster for the damage his clothes had received when the riot was at its height. "Luck is ever waiting for something to turn up," says Cobden. "Labor, with keen eyes and strong will turn up something. Luck lies in bed and wishes the postman would bring him the news of a legacy. Labor turns out at 6 o'clock, and with busy pen or ringing hammer lays the foundation of a competence. Luck whines. Labor whistles. Luck relies on chance. Labor on character. There is no luck, for all practical purposes, to him who is not striving, and whose senses are not all eagerly attent. What are called accidental discoveries are almost invariably made by those who are looking for something. A man incurs about as much risk of being struck by lightning as by accidental luck. There is perhaps an element of luck in the amount of success which crowns the efforts of different men, but even here it will usually be found that the sagacity with which the efforts are directed and the energy with which they are prosecuted measure pretty accurately the luck contained in the results achieved. Apparent exceptions will be found to relate almost wholly to single undertakings, while in the long run the rule will hold good. Two pearl divers, equally expert, dive together and work with equal energy. One brings up a pearl, while the other returns empty-handed. But let both persevere, and at the end of 5, 10, or 20 years, it will be found that they succeeded almost in exact proportion to their skill and industry. Lincoln, being asked by an anxious visitor what he would do after 3 or 4 years if the rebellion was not subdued, replied, "Oh, there is no alternative but to keep pegging away." "It is in me, and it shall come out," said Sheridan, when told that he would never make an orator, as he had failed in his first speech in Parliament. he became known as one of the foremost orators of his day. It takes great courage to fight a lost cause when there is no hope even of victory. To contest every inch of ground with as much persistency and enthusiasm as if we were assured of victory, this is true courage. The world admires the man who never flinches from unexpected difficulties, who calmly, patiently, and courageously grapples with his fate, who dies, if need be, at his post. President Chadbourne put grit in place of his lost lung, and worked 35 years after his funeral had been planned. Henry Fawcett put grit in place of eyesight, and became the greatest Postmaster General England ever had. Prescott also put grit in place of eyesight, and became one of America's greatest historians. Francis Parkman put grit in place of health and eyesight, and became the greatest historian of America in his line. Thousands of men have put grit in place of health, eyes, ears, hands, legs, and yet have achieved marvelous success. Indeed, most of the great things of the world have been accomplished by grit and pluck. You cannot keep a man down who has these qualities. He will make stepping stones out of his stumbling blocks, and lift himself to success. Grit and pluck are not always exhibited only by poor boys who have no chance, for there are many notable examples of pluck, persistence, and real grit among youth in good circumstances, who never have to fight their way to their own loaf. Mr. Mifflin, who has recently become the head of the celebrated publishing firm of Houghton, Mifflin and Company, is a notable example of persistency, push, and grit. After graduating at Harvard and traveling abroad, he was determined, although not obliged, to work for a living, to get a position at the Riverside Press in Cambridge. He called upon the late Mr. Houghton and asked him for a situation. Mr. Houghton told him that he had no opening, and that even if he had, he did not believe that a graduate from Harvard, who had money and who had traveled abroad, would ever be willing to begin at the bottom and do the necessary drudgery for boy's pay. Mr. Mifflin protested that he was not afraid of hard work, and that he was willing to do anything and take any sort of a position if he could only learn the business. But Mr. Houghton would not give him any encouragement. Again and again Mr. Mifflin came to the Riverside Press and pressed his suit, but to no purpose. Mr. Mifflin persuaded his father to intercede for him, but Mr. Houghton succeeded in convincing him that it would be very unwise for his son to attempt it. But young Mifflin was determined not to give up. Finally, Mr. Houghton, out of admiration for his persistence and pluck, made a place for him, which had been occupied by a boy, for $5 a week. Young Mifflin took hold of the work with such earnestness, and showed so much pluck and determination, that Mr. Houghton soon called him into the office and raised his pay to $9 a week from the time he began. Although the young man lived in Boston, he was always at the Riverside Press in Cambridge early in the morning, and would frequently remain after all the others had gone. Mr. Houghton happened to go in late one night, after everybody had gone as he supposed, and was surprised to find Mr. Mifflin there taking one of the presses apart. Of course such a young man would be advanced. These are the boys who become the heads of firms. It is victory after victory with the soldier, lesson after lesson with the scholar, blow after blow with the laborer, crop after crop with the farmer, picture after picture with the painter, and mile after mile with the traveler, that secures what all so much desire: success. Stick to the thing and carry it through. Believe you were made for the place you fill, and that no one else can fill it as well. Put forth your whole energies. Be awake, electrify yourself, go forth to the task. Only once learn to carry a thing through in all its completeness and proportion, and you will become a hero. You will think better of yourself. Others will think better of you. The world in its very heart admires the stern, determined doer. End of chapter 20.